Hello and welcome to the Common Hour. My name is Rachel Anderson Rayburn and I'm the chair of the Common Hour Committee and an associate professor of theater. I'd like to introduce our ASL interpreter, Cindy Mees. Thank you, Cindy, for interpreting Common Hour for us all year. Today's very exciting event is the last Common Hour of the semester and the academic year. We appreciate everyone's support of Common Hour through the pandemic, from attendees to proposers and sponsors of events. The Common Hour community remains a source of inspiration, education, and compelling discussion for the F&M community and beyond. Common Hour will remain remote in the fall, but we will be going back to our customary time slot of 11:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. on Thursdays. The first Common Hour of the fall semester will feature F&M's president, Barbara K. Altman, on September 2nd, and the whole fall calendar will be announced in May. Please follow Common Hour on our webpage, Facebook, and Instagram page. During today's event, Zoom viewers can submit questions for our speaker via the Q&A feature. Please identify yourself as an FPS member or a student. We don't use anyone's name. And our virtual pizza server group today is Mi Gente Latina. Mi Gente Latina is a multicultural club founded on campus in 1991 that is focused on spreading awareness about and appreciation of Latinx culture. More than just a student organization, Mi Gente Latina is a large family that welcomes all members of the Franklin and Marshall community to their events and Wednesday night meetings. And now I'd like to introduce the proposer of today's event, Anne Stachura, coordinator of Spanish community-based learning and community outreach.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Mi Gente, for the pizza. Today's event is truly a community collaboration. My colleague and collaborator, Wilfredo Seda from SACA Broadcasting, has brought this event to the F&M community. So I will have him introduce our speaker. But first, I would like to thank him and thank all of the organizations who have supported us for this event, including the Writers House, who sponsored our In the Heights reading group, which we hosted with Disrupt Theater Company, Lancaster's BIPOC theater group, and Teatro Paloma, Lancaster's Latinx theater group. Teatro Paloma is performing their show Looking Bilingue virtually this weekend, and they have 5 free tickets to offer to the F&M and Lancaster community. If you are interested in getting a free ticket to their event, please email me. My email will be in the chat. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. I'm going to share my screen. I'd like to thank the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts and SACA, the Spanish American Civic Association, a nonprofit organization that has been supporting the Lancaster Latino community for more than 40 years. Thank you to all of them. And now, from SACA Broadcasting, Mr. Wilfredo Seda.
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, everybody. I have the honor to present Quiara Alegria Hudes, and she's a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright of Water by the Spoonful, author of a memoir, My Broken Language, and screenwriter for the major motion picture In the Heights, to be released in early June of this year. Previously, she wrote the book, also the script for the Tony Award-winning Broadway musical In the Heights, with other plays and musicals that have been produced around the world. Her notable essays include High Tide of Heartbreak in American Theater magazine and Corey Couldn't Take It Anymore in the Cut. In opposition to the carceral state, Hudes and her cousin founded Emancipated Stories, a platform where people behind bars can share one page of their life story with the world. As a barrio feminist and joyous mischief maker, Quiara y su hermana, her sister, created the Latinx Casting Manifesto. A passionate wife and mom, Hudes is a native of West Philly and now lives with her family in Washington Heights, New York, and unceded Munsee Lenape land. So I present to you Quiara Alegria Hudes. Welcome.
Gracias, Wilfredo. Thank you so much. Hello, Lancaster and neighboring areas. Thank you all for coming. I feel very grateful today to be in community, even virtually and remotely with you all. I was saying that I'm a little bit familiar with the Boricua community in Lancaster because one of the In the Heights original Broadway actors was from the community, Eliseo Roman. So he was like, Philly Boricua? I was like, Lancaster Boricua? And that's how we got wind of each other's backgrounds. So as Wilfredo said, I am a playwright. I have worked on Broadway. I have been honored with a Pulitzer Prize. I'm a screenwriter. I have 2 movies coming out this summer. One is In the Heights that I wrote with Lin-Manuel Miranda. I'm very proud of that movie, and I hope you all get a chance to see it. It's really soon. It's coming out in June. And the other movie is called Vivo, and that's going to come out on Netflix, and that's an animated film about delivering a long-lost love song to a faraway, long-lost love. So I don't know the date of that release yet, but they're going to announce it soon. They said it's going to be this summer, and I've been working on those things for many years. The other thing I've been working on for many years, it's funny how I can work on something for 5 or 10 years and they all happen at the same time. So in the course of 3 months, 3 projects I've been working on for a decade come to light. The third one is my memoir. It's called My Broken Language. And it's the story of how I became a writer. Not what happened after I became a writer, but what led me to that path. And that's what I would like to share with you all today. I'm going to speak for, let me see what time we're at. I'm going to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes. And then I would love to hear your questions and what's on your mind. You can ask me questions about the book and the passages you hear today. You can ask me any questions about my other work, life as a writer. I believe that there are some theater students and theater community members in the audience, so I would love to talk about theater and playwriting too, whatever's on your mind, so I get a sense of who's out there and I'm not just speaking into a void. I thought what I would do is read 4 brief passages from my book and talk you through what they meant in my life. So, My Broken Language ends around 2004. In 2002, after being the first in my household to go to college, shout out to any first generation college students in attendance today. So in 2002, I went to graduate school, and there I met Paula Vogel, who was my writing teacher. And she said something that changed my life forever. What she said was, your Spanish is broken, write your broken Spanish. That changed everything. I was ashamed before then of the fact that my Spanish wasn't nearly as good as my English. I thought that marked me as a failure, as a failed Boricua. And she said, embrace the brokenness. Write your broken Spanish. And so I did. And that's the kind of writer I became. Now, leading up to that point in my life, I encountered so many different languages. And each different language has a different chapter in this book. So I want to read you a little bit about the languages I was working with, my broken languages, and how they inspired me to become a writer. So I'm going to start with chapter 4, A Name That Is a Mask. And before I even get into my different languages, it's just about my name, Quiara Alegria Hudes. I'm 5 years old in this. I'm going into kindergarten, and we have just moved from Philadelphia, which was a very diverse place I grew up, to a very white segregated suburb. And it's a shock to the system. Malvern was only an hour outside Philly, but it was a whole different universe. The woods, donkeys, and horses didn't account for half of it. We had moved to a monolingual, pale world. Its language uniformity was so complete as to be creepy, zombie-esque. How the shopkeepers and mailmen spoke English confidently and pronounced all their vowels the same exact way. How within houses I visited, the kids, parents, and elders shared the same language and never paused for translation or to remember a word. Though Malvern folks didn't pray to ancestors like Mom did, I could tell that if they did, their ghosts would speak English too. My Inglés was as good as the next Malvernites, but Mom's wasn't, and I sensed trouble ahead. At kindergarten roll call, the teacher pronounced my Q the English way, so my name sounded like slime. After squinting at some error in the attendance book, she swapped the letters in my middle name. Algeria? All the kids screamed, ew, because they'd heard of an African country like that. Algeria, Algeria! I told them it was alegría and meant happiness in Spanish. Then why does it sound ugly? A boy snorted. By the time the Pledge of Allegiance arrived, I had stopped correcting them. Alegría was amputated from my book reports and homework like a gangrenous toe. I had to contain the damage to Quiara and Hudes. According to Mom, there had been a Quiara, C-I-A-R-A, a few Quiaras with a K, and many Quiaras before me, C-H-I-A-R-R-A, but never a Quiara. She invented a conjugation of querer to mean beloved. Whenever a classmate mocked my name, my guts coiled hot as a stovetop. Still, beneath the burn of mockery, I harbored a superhero secret because I was a brand new word. Alegría was not chosen for its sunny meaning, but to honor Ricardo Alegria, a Puerto Rican anthropologist. Mom described the Taíno ceremonial grounds he uncovered and documented. Never having been to the island, I couldn't really imagine petroglyphs or standing stones. Before El Profesor, Mom explained, our island's indigenous roots had been silenced. But then Alegria wrote his books on the Taínos. A library shelf holds tremendous power, Quiara. If it's not written down, it doesn't exist. Though she had never attained college, she talked with reverence about books and scholarship. El Profesor brought us into the light. He was a revolutionary. So your middle name, Alegría, is revolution masked as happiness. Hudes came from Dad, of course. Dad rarely spoke about Jewish stuff, his surname being no exception. If it was rooted in some language or meant anything, it was news to me. All I knew was that the U was squishy, like in beautiful or cute, but strangers said it the double O way, like moo or boot. A silent U in Quiara and a spherical U in Hudes, a name that broke its own rules. So that's a taste of my name as it relates to my languages. As you can surmise from that short passage, I'm biracial. So my mother is a brown Boricua. She was born and raised in Arecibo, Puerto Rico, and came to Philadelphia when she was about 11 years old. And my father was a white man, Jewish, secular. And so that was some of my background. Now, very soon after this kindergarten incident, we ended up moving back to the city. So I didn't live in that segregated environment for very long in my life. We moved back to Philly and I was around family and neighbors that had many different backgrounds, including a very vibrant Boricua community. So another language I talk about in the book is actually two languages, and they're both relevant to this next passage I'm going to read. By now, I'm in middle school, and I've spent some of the book talking about body language and also the language of the spirits. The language of the spirits is one that came naturally to my mother. She is a santera, which is a priest in Lucumí, which is commonly known as Santeria. She was a very gifted empath, a very gifted herbalist and shaman, and I didn't have that gift. So I really saw her language of the spirits with a lot of awe and confusion. Another language was body language. Now, this was the 80s and 90s, and in El Barrio in Philly, a lot was going down in that time. There was a lot of struggle. I went to too many funerals of cousins that were too young to be seen in their caskets by little cousin me. These were deaths due to HIV and AIDS. Some cousins just disappeared and then came back on the scene, and those disappearances were due to addiction. In one case, gun violence that blinded one of my cousins. And I was the youngest cousin. These were my idols. I loved them, I revered them, and I saw them struggle, and it upset me because I knew them to be good souls. But I also saw them celebrate through hard times. And in particular, I saw them dance. I saw them dance to Juan Luis Guerra, shaking their asses, just living life through their body. And I wasn't very good at that. I was an intellectual. I kind of lived up here. And so body language was another language that I studied in my loved ones and in my community, but that I didn't totally feel comfortable speaking. So in this passage, I discuss my mother's religion, her religious path, and all the ceremonies I've witnessed in our living room. These include bembes and toques, which for the bata drums, which are in Orisha, and they speak, the drums speak. They include cleansings and animal sacrifice. A lot of things that confused me, that I didn't understand, but that I recognized a real power in at the same time and was curious about. And on this night, something different happened that I had never seen before from Mom. So I'm in middle school here, and we're back in Philadelphia. Later that night, by the flow of the downstairs conversation, I knew real shit was underway. Bata drums thickened the atmosphere like humidity. I couldn't make out the words, only general urgency. Some voices I recognized. Cedo, my not quite stepfather, a Boricua contractor Mom had been seeing for years. He got in a word or two. Padrino Julio's familiar cadence was lilting, with his signature trace of giggle. He was Mom's mentor in the religion, an elderly Santero Oba, whose kindness softened my reticence. He aimed affection my way without asking permission or demanding reciprocation. For that, I favored him. I knew Mom was downstairs too, as she had called me to greet Padrino Julio y le pidiera la bendición. I could not hear her at present, though. An unfamiliar male voice held forth, his authority galloping in on quick words and melodic inflection. No one interrupted or spoke over this powerful man. In their silence, I inferred deference and profound respect. I stood at the upstairs landing for a very long time, leaning over, hand to ear. Who was this house guest? What did his presence signal? One step at a time, that's how I descended, telling myself, turn back with every inch of progress. Toward the bottom, I cursed my own curiosity. I sat in protest, hoping to stall my forward motion. But my desire to advance was strong, and I descended the steps in a seated position. At last, the living room unfolded before me. 3 people sat at the table, Mom, Cedo, and Padrino Julio. There was no strange visitor in sight. Mom was the stranger. She was a man. From her mouth flowed the voice I had heard upstairs, a plosive nasal Spanish with some dialect spliced in. What Creole tongue, what pidgin words these were, I hadn't a clue. A twang of the ancient rode the cadence. By the sound, this was a frisky spirit and wise. Even the bones in Mom's face were changed. Her slender nose widened, her overbite reversed so that her bottom jaw thrust forward as if rolling a marble between her front teeth. She was squatter now, her usually soft shoulders broad and firm. Se montó el espíritu. The men sat with her, alert and listening. Padrino Julio fed her rum and asked questions, the answers to which Cedo transcribed in a marble notebook. He filled the pages quickly, his pen resting only when he needed a new page. Occasionally, Padrino Julio sought clarity before the next question. The spelling of some unfamiliar town, perhaps, that he'd check on later. Can you repeat that person's name, please? She, not she, answered. Then lifted Bacardi to her lips, tipped the jug, and swigged down a third of the nearly full rum. Surely she would vomit or seize. Aside from a beer during spring cleaning, Mom never drank. But she slammed down the bottle and the interview continued apace. My body railed, hating the scene, knees trembling madly, teeth chattering, fingers squeezing my jaw into silence. I was a crab in the undertow, flailing as the current churned. I wanted to scream, "Stop! You're gonna hurt my mom!" To run and wipe sweat from this face that was not hers, to reach down her throat and yank out the spirit. First Guido, then Big Vic, then Mary Lou, now Mom? Everyone I loved, lost. Mom wasn't mine, I now understood. Never had been. She belonged to herself and the province of the spirits, but never me. My thoughts turned to that distant 4th of July, how hard my cousins danced, how propulsive and insistent their hips had been, as if conducted by some magnificent force. That gathering had been secular, this one was spiritual, and yet a pulse is a pulse is a pulse. A drum is a drum is a drum. Yes, it was true, and here lay the evidence. Dance and possession were dialects off the same mother tongue. I spoke neither. English, my best language, had no vocabulary for the possession nor the dance. And English was what I was made of. My words and my world did not align. That perhaps made me a lost soul. So that's the scene that deals with the language of possession and some more body language observations I made, connecting my spiritual family life with my dance family life. I've never read that passage aloud, except for when I recorded the audiobook, and it's really intense to relive it like that in a group of people. So thank you for bearing witness to this. So I was a confused kid. I didn't know how to make sense of my life. I didn't have the vocabulary to make sense of my life. Some kind of confusion and lost in translations were a little more comical and a little more light than the passage I just read. And this next passage is about Spanish and English. It's just about bilingualism and things that get lost in translation. And actually, even though English was my mother's second language, how she really was quite innovative with the English language. And I learned so much about it from her, even though it's my first language and I was more fluent. She was more creative with the English language. So here's something I learned from my mom about the English language. Now, I'm still in middle school here. And this is a night that we're getting a lot of crank calls from some of Mom's enemies in the community, some people who did not like my mom. And they were calling over and over and over again. And I was answering the phone and they were saying, "Your mother's a whore." And I would hang up the phone. It was very upsetting to me. And I didn't want my mom to answer the phone because I didn't want her to hear that someone was calling to say that about her. So this is what happened. That's why this thing's been ringing off the hook? I had tried to shield her from the calls. Some nights she had been cooking and blasting Celia Cruz louder than the ringer. Others she was out working late. Now it rang again. Don't answer, Mom said, running to rinse off the garlic. She returned clean-handed and grabbed the receiver with steady poise. Hello? Again, the word was hissed more than spoken. Whore. That's just sad. Do you even know what you're saying? Mom sighed. The line went dead. The ring repeated, as did the slander. Whore. You know something. You may have a point. Call it to me again. They obliged. Whore. I bet you didn't think you'd be my teacher tonight. What am I? Whore. When the line went dead, Mom craned her neck to God. I caught your transmission, ma phone. Her giggles gathered until the next ring, when she answered simply by blurting, give it to me. Whore. Mom lost it. Woman cracked up, laughter flying like Sunday hallelujahs, hitting soprano notes I didn't know she had. Stop it, Mom, it's not funny. They have no idea what they're calling me. How do we say whore en el barrio? Mom asked. Puta? How else? Ho? Exacto, ho. Now tell me, Quiara, what is a hoe? A woman who's shamed for her sexuality? It's the shame men have given us from the get-go. The shame that is written into the Bible. But think, Quiara, what else is a hoe? I want you to make this connection yourself. Racking my brain, I came up short. Ho, she yelled as if volume was a code cracker. Asada, asada, asada. What is a hoe, Quiara? A gardening tool. And what does a hoe do? She asked. Digs. It's an ancient tool with a sharp blade for clearing and turning the soil. When the earth gets tired, you break the earth. You wound the earth, digging narrow troughs and trenches, so you can do what? Plant seeds. Plant seeds, she rejoiced, all affirmation. They think they're shaming me, but they have no clue that they're praising me. We are not whores, we are hoes. We plow the land. We plow our reality. We plant seeds of potential. I am hoeing on Cero's potential. I am hoeing on the potential of my community. I have been hoeing your potential since day one, hija. Resplendent and alive, she answered each call. The word whore, when missiled her way, was met with the laugh of a honey-sated bear. Mom's laughter caught me until both our feet hoofed the floorboards, both our fists pounded the sofa, and our faces contorted and torqued with pain. But still, we laughed. So yes, that's a passage about Mom teaching me, giving me some lessons on the English language. And I was never able to hear the word whore the same way again. So another part of my language in my childhood and my teenage years was music. I was a very depressed child and adolescent, and music really helped. My father, Cero, who you hear in the book, and as he becomes a bigger part of my life, I start to call him Pop. That's the title that I give him. And Pop found a piano that has survived a church fire, and the church was going to be demolished. And he bought this piano from the church sale for $22. And he brought it into the house, and I started playing piano. I played everything. I played along to Phil Collins on the radio. I wrote my own songs. I played Bach minuets. And my favorite was Chopin, because it was so sad and melancholy. And I could, by playing that music, tell people about how sad I was and how lonely I felt without having to put words on it. And they would listen, and they would respect the communication through the song. So music saved me. When English frustrated me because it didn't have the words to say what was in my soul, music came and saved me. When Spanish frustrated me because I wasn't good enough at it and I felt like a failure, I could play that Chopin nocturne. If I couldn't dance along to Bachata Rosa like my cousins could, I could play for them and they would listen. And I even sometimes had a spiritual feeling while playing piano. I played piano right by my mother's throne, her altars that were really beautiful. And so I would sometimes kind of get a peek of Django or Diamaya as I played. And I felt proximity to them while playing. So after I went to college, and after I graduated, I returned to Philadelphia and was playing as a professional musician. And this is about a turning point, a gig I had. I got called to open for Gil Scott-Heron. Now, if you've never heard of him, he's a very, very important spoken word poet and kind of respected and revered as the father of hip hop. You've probably heard the phrase, "the revolution will not be televised." That's a poem he wrote. Now it's just out there in the culture, but he pens that. So this is an experience I had opening for Gil Scott-Heron. And it's one of the last musical experiences I had before I quit music and went into writing. And this passage explains a little bit why even music, the language I loved the most, revealed to me that it was no longer enough. And this is going to be the final passage I read this afternoon. And then, like I said before, I would love to hear your questions and be in conversation with you about what's on your mind. Okay, so here we are. I'm in my 20s now. After the sound check, I joined the old poet in the back room. There was time to kill before the house opened. The room was dim and derelict, with stuffing clouding out the sofa. Heron's unkempt silver afro and old leather blazer spoke of a guy whose ups and downs had blended into a cohesive whole. His hips were too narrow for his jeans, cheeks too gaunt for his beard. He rolled a joint, toked deep, and passed it to his conga player, then flautist. He always requested local kids to open his shows, he said. They kept him current, often sampling his work on future tracks. He held a toke, then spread his lips and let it swirl out naturally. So, what's your story? West Philly, born and bred. Right on. And what are you about? What's your story? His players nodded, approving the question, waiting for their minds to be blown or simply to meet a fellow traveler. But I sat there like story was a vocab word I'd never bothered learning, as though I had no name, let alone one that broke its own rules, let alone one that meant revolution masked as happiness. My brain felt Men in Black zapped. This cat had lost his following, his weight, and some teeth. Poetry didn't pay much, but he never lost his story, the about attached to his bones. So who are you, Quiara? Who is Kiki? ¿Quién eres? How Kiki be? Who? What? When? Where? Why? How? Grade school shit. And the half-breed Ivy Leaguer had nothing. You're up, hon. I took the stage. Applause occurred. Keys were pressed. Notes emanated from vocal cords. But I felt hollow as a tree trunk with upturned roots. I listened to my songs like an operating room specimen, a spirit hovering above the bright lights, looking down at her anesthetized body. What characterized my chords and lyrics, I pondered, other than a general pleasantness? Life is nice, sometimes a bit hard. Romance feels good. That was the thesis written all over my music, agreeable and undisruptive. My songs were a pantomime, a picket fence. Applause happened again. A body shaped like mine left the stage. Next up, put your hands together. A conga guy perched and slapped a groove. A flautist stood and looped a hook. The old poet looked at the black, brown, and white faces between brick walls. His disheveled leather blazer brushed against the mic. A rat done bit my sister Nell with Whitey on the moon. Her arms and face began to swell. He was funny, if salt in the sugar dish made you chuckle. He was real in a world that liked dress up, poor in a city of new glass towers, unpleasant before a camera that said wave and smile. It bordered on embarrassing, the old poet's lack of adornment, words that poked fingers in the American socket. Zap, char, spark, you've been burned. The old shame was at me again, the one that visited when I was asked if I believed in God, the one that choked me when ice cubes went clink and I smiled and nodded about the inner city problem. The old shame that loved my silence, that embraced me when I clammed up, warming me like a partner in bed. I wanted to be done with it, to venture out on my own, but without shame's evergreen love of my silence, would I speak out and freeze to death, alone in America, with no blanket to warm me? This is not some rags to riches tale. If you skip ahead to the final chapter, you will not find me knocking on Larry Gold's studio door, announcing how wrong he'd been to reject me. This is 40-something Quiara, issuing an internal storm watch. This is my warning lobbed right at the mirror, that if you ask for an audience, you best have something to say. That if you have something to say, the clock is ticking on the hours left to say it. These are notes to self on a memoir I am drafting at my desk at 1:48 p.m. It is a late October afternoon. Gray and rain greet me through the window, and I type a writer's prayer with you, dear reader, as my witness. May silence, that evergreen seductress, not turn these pages too palatable. May I stand alone beneath the stage lights, honest and embarrassing as an old poet. After that passage, I decided to become a writer. And I went to Providence, Rhode Island, and I met Paula Vogel, and she told me to write my broken languages. And that's what I did. I went on to write a Broadway show. I went on to write dramas about La Comunidad and my family. And here I am today, sharing my story with you, suspecting that if any of you watching in the community have ever felt at a loss of words, have ever felt curious about the languages around you, or that you don't have the vocabulary to say who you are, hoping that this story will make a connection. So with that, I would love to open up this conversation and hear what's on your mind, hear what you would like to chat about today with the final 15 or 20 minutes of this presentation.
Thank you so much. It's incredibly beautiful, and we have a lot to talk to you about. I'm going to give you a first question from a staff member, and they ask you, how did you decide that you wanted or needed to write a memoir, and what were the challenges and delights of writing it?
Books were so important to me. I love books. And the reason I loved books, my love of literature really started in high school. And the thing I loved most about books is it was such a private conversation with the writer. So theater and music were different. Those are communal arts. Those are arts to be shared in groups of people, and they forge community. But before you can have a discussion about a book with your community, you encounter it alone in the privacy of your heart and the privacy of your mind. So it was only natural. I really wanted to write a book because they had been so central in my life, but I'm really glad I waited till I was in my 40s to write one. Because I didn't even realize, I didn't know about my broken languages. I didn't know until I wrote the book. And I was able to look back and discover a lot in the process of writing, discover really who I was and what my journey meant. I didn't understand it while living it. And also the community has changed a lot. So HIV and crack cocaine are things we have largely survived. We have new challenges as a community today. And so I was able to look back at that time, and those are undertold stories. They were told in the news, and it was very ugly how we were portrayed in the news at that time. We were not portrayed as humans. And so I wanted to be a part of telling this undertold story from within the community with integrity and respect. And hindsight is very helpful for me with that. I'm not a journalist, I'm not a reporter, so I don't know how to be in the middle of a story and report on it. Time helps me understand. And so that's why now felt like a good time to write the memoir.
Could you say a little bit more about this, this sort of movement from being alone, and alone as a writer in particular, to then seeing your work live in others, and what that feels like?
Well, it's very different as a playwright and as a book writer. As a playwright, it gives me so much anxiety. If there's any playwrights watching, but I think even directors and anyone in theater understands, like, the public I have a private process of using my imagination and my creativity when I'm writing a play. And I have to go really deep, and I have to, I always want to be like very real and very raw, but also very funny. I want to touch these different emotions. And so I have to kind of experience them as I write it. And then this thing happens that there's this thing called previews in the theater where you're still writing the piece, but the audience starts to come. And once an audience starts to come, it's really terrible. Like, the ego just becomes your worst enemy. And the ego is just going, oh, like me, like me, like me, like me. But as you heard in the chapter I read about the old poet, I didn't become a writer to be liked. I became a writer to stand under the stage lights, embarrassing and real. That's different than wanting to be liked. So I'm having like this like ego battle in my head during writing plays. Plus I'm watching the audience. If they don't think a joke is funny, I have to rewrite a joke. If I can feel that my dramatic scene is not landing, I have to go home and like rewrite that scene that night, and the actors have to learn it the next day. It's super duper stressful because you're still creating it so you need to have that private experience as a writer while the public is interfacing with it. It's extremely stressful. It's a little easier. That part of writing a book is a little easier because I finished writing the book a year ago. And so I have a year then it goes into production, and I have a year to reflect on what have I created. I have a year to understand it more, to have family conversations about it. By the time it's out in the world, I've gotten quite used to what it is, and it's not quite such an ego battle for me. And so I love the thought of people having private experiences with it, and people have started to reach out. I heard from a poet in the Bronx who was named Bronx American Indian of 2018, I believe, Bobby Gonzalez, and his parents were spiritualists. I think he said his brother was a santero. And I couldn't believe it. Like, these people whose paths were so similar to mine, who I'd never met. So it's really beautiful to hear from people who are relating to the book also.
We have another question. The next, I don't know who it's from, but here it is. What are your thoughts on matching a show's demographics to the demographics of a particular theater community? Should we do a show if we aren't completely sure we'd have the correct people to fill the roles?
Can you repeat the question one more time? I just want to understand the first part of it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on matching a show's demographics to the demographics of a particular theater community? Should we do a show if we aren't completely sure we'd have the correct people to fill the roles? Which sounds to me like a question about the identity of character and the identity of actor. Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, the first question I have for this asker, and feel free to actually pop into the chat with a response or not, is whether it's educational theater or professional theater. So my answers would differ in those examples. We've had school productions of all backgrounds do In the Heights, for example. And I think that's okay as long as it's done with a lot of sensitivity and really detailed research because we're learning in school, but professionally it is different. And so I have to give approval for any production that doesn't have the appropriate casting. So if you're going to cast a non-Latino actor in a Latino role, I have to give approval for that. And I look at it case by case, but oftentimes the answer is no, unfortunately, even though these theater companies have wonderful, beautiful intentions, that's not a question. But if they can't cast a role appropriately, maybe they're not ready yet to do the piece. And sometimes, you know, there's lots of gray area too. So sometimes the answer is yes. It's hard in small communities, right? Like you might fall in love with a piece and feel that it would matter to your community, but not actually have the actors to pull it off. You know, maybe need to find a grant and bring in an actor from outside the community. The other thing, I really like this question, and these are thoughts I think about all the time as a theater artist, is not just the demographics of who is being cast and put on stage, but also the demographics of who is sitting in the audience. As a playwright who has written a lot of Latino stories and a lot of Latino roles, I've had my work done at, Rachel mentioned, she worked at Teatro Milagro in Portland, Oregon. That's a small Latino theater company that had a very diverse audience. I've worked at those sorts of places, and I've worked at theaters that have like a 100% white audience. And those are different experiences, and different things happen to the actors on stage and the characters in the piece, depending on who is looking at them. And so I think theaters have to also be very sensitive and mindful of who is encountering these stories and how do you create conversations. Both of those are totally valid models of producing, but they're not the same thing. And it can be actually really hard. I will say this, for an all Latino cast, to be looked at like this the whole time with like a weird separate sense of distance and separation, that can become a very demoralizing thing for a Latino cast. So, you know, in those cases, I try to encourage theaters to be much more sensitive to the actors and to be more proactively create dialogue and conversation around the cultural elements that their audience might not be familiar with.
How do you see that taking shape in educational theater?
You know, in educational theater, I think the hard thing, I think in educational theater, it's not the audience that is being served as much as the student performers and the student cast and crew and artistic crew. So you want student actors to have opportunities to hone their craft. And a lot of that does involve casting outside of race or ethnicity or identity, gender, these sorts of things. You see that a lot. The tricky thing is, for instance, I had a school, some students reach out to me who, there were Latino students in the program, and there was a large Latino student body beyond the theater program, but they had not been cast in lead roles and in the Heights. That, they were troubled by this, and I really understood their point of view. I do think that's troubling if there's only one show that you're actually like would professionally be cast in the whole time you're a student and you don't get that opportunity. I don't care whose seniority, who earned it or whatever, all that stuff, that I don't think was appropriately handled by the school. So I think being really sensitive to the concerns of students who would identify with those roles and prioritizing that is also part, you know, it's not just, theater is not just a technical practice where you practice being better on stage and singing better notes and all this sort of stuff. It is also a practice of integrity and respect and storytelling. And the stories we tell through how we proceed with our practice are just as important as the play itself.
It's a great reminder that that includes the makeup of the audience as well. The power of the gaze that the audience has on sort of shaping the experience of the performers.
Yes, yes, I've had that happen. Sometimes I get to a production and the actors are just off stage, especially if it's like an all white audience or like an all wealthy audience, like the actors like, help us, you have to get some Latinos into this theater. So it's like, I'm not the playwright anymore. I become like the marketing person, and I like literally go out into the community and I'm finding out like who are the professional Latino organizations in the community, who are the student Latino organizations, like people who might be interested in going to the theater, and trying to have conversations with them and welcome them into the play, just so that honestly, my actors aren't like losing their mind every night.
Mm-hmm. This is a question from a student. The student says, I love the way you read. You give each character a voice. Is that how you write film scripts and create characters, by imagining and saying out loud what you think the character would sound like in your head?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I do not consider myself a performer, but I have actually really loved reading the memoir out loud. It's different, but because it's me, I feel like I can do it with authority. It was really wild to read that possession passage just now. That is not one I have read aloud for an audience before.
It was very intense. It showed.
Super intense. Oh my gosh. It's super intense. So I kind of like relived that intense moment in my childhood. I am and have always been absolutely obsessed to do that with the English language, even though it's what I speak every day. So I love that. And so when I do a lot of eavesdropping, and when I pay attention to how people speak, whether they're using verbs in this way or in that way. And so, yeah, like that's the music. That's my favorite music. That's my favorite music. And when I'm writing dialogue, if it's a screenplay, if it's a stage play, I want that music. I want that dialogue to sing like music. Definitely. And I want each character to be like a different instrument in the orchestra. You know, if they're all the piano, it doesn't sound good. But if one character is like the piano and the other character is the drum and the other character is the tuba, you know, then you got like some real good music going on there.
That sounds like you didn't quit music. It sounds like you shifted your instrument.
I did not quit music. Indeed. I did from like a kind of superficial point of view, but I do think that my life in music and all my musical training was writing training.
We have a question from a faculty member, and they say first, thank you so much for this deep dive into your experiences. Writing for an animation and writing for a musical seems so very different. How did you move into such a wide variety of genres? It's not like you're a one-trick wonder resting on the amazing success of one form of your early work.
Okay, I have a few different thoughts about this question. The first is like, in this book, in my broken language, if any of you read it out there, towards the end, I meet a character called the Boy. And I fall in love with him. He's mostly off stage, but I do mention like I was in love. It was young love. I was a young professional. Like, so that I was 17. We're still a thing. Like, we're still together. I have had a very long stretch of like monogamy and commitment. And I think that's it. Like, I've used up all of my like monogamy on my relationship. And I just don't have that level of focus on writing. So I'm just like, let me try this. Let me try that. Like, I'm like, what do they call it? Like, I date many different forms of writing. But I also think, you know, you might go to school. I went to school for music and I became a writer. You might go to school for acting and find out that producing is also becomes a very important part of your art practice and your professional practice. I don't like the notion of like over specializing. It kind of limits us. So I went to school for playwriting, yes. But I always wrote poems. I always wrote short stories. I always just was a writer, not like a playwright. So, you know, by studying and focusing on one craft, I think you learn and can apply those lessons to multiple crafts.
This is a question from a staff member. Lancaster and particularly McCaskey High School are proud of alumnus Eliseo Roman. Can you tell us a little about... Well, Lancaster is very proud of them. Can you tell us a little about meeting and working with him on In the Heights, and what words of wisdom might you have for theater students aspiring to write, act, sing, direct?
Meeting Eliseo, well, for those out there who know him or have heard the Broadway cast album of In the Heights, so he sings the song Piragua. And it's like a sweet salsa ditty a little bit, except for it's super operatic and there's a crazy high note. So he's like sings, que calor, piragua, piragua, new block of ice, piragua. He's an amazing voice. He could hit this note without even making a face like he's hitting anything. He'd just be like, piragua. You know, he goes so high, but his face looks totally chill. It was really cool. You know, when I was in my 20s when we started casting In the Heights. And one thing I love so much about being a playwright, which a book will never give me, is like, you create jobs. You actually create jobs in the community. And there is no pride like seeing the people you've hired. So when I was meeting Eliseo, when I was meeting Andrea Burns, when I was meeting Mandy Gonzalez and Karen Olivo, I was like, these are highly skilled people. And I created a job that they're going to excel at. Like, that is amazing. And I was also working with all these Latino theater artists. So to me, they feel like brothers and sisters because our interests were so close. Eliseo is walking joy. He is also the most loyal and supportive friend you can imagine. We lived a lot of life together, me and the In the Heights cast. There were highs and lows, ups and downs. I had a baby during In the Heights. You know, people lost parents during In the Heights. People fell in love and got married. And he was always one of the ones who was there for people in hard times. Like, he was a really good kind of counselor in that sense. And he's also just loads of fun. He's just totally loads of fun. So that, you know, that's a little bit about Eli, as we called him. And words of advice for young people who are interested in the arts. The only word for advice, I'm guessing this comes very naturally to the students already, so I'm just probably saying something you already know, but just keep doing it for fun. Have a great time. If you're acting, get your friend to write a monologue for you or write a monologue for yourself and perform it for your friends after school. Like, if you're writing, find a few other writers and put together a little magazine of you and your writer friends. Like, get your work out there, keep creating. You learn by doing, and you also get so much joy and satisfaction out of doing. So that's my advice.
Really was really taken with something that you read from your memoir about, you know, if you're going to ask for an audience, you better have something to say when you show up. How has what you've had to say changed? How has it changed as you've gone through different parts of your career, as you've become a parent, as you've lived different places and experienced different things?
Some of it hasn't. Some of it remains. The reason I decided to become a writer had a lot to do with oral histories and community stories that were really not part of the written record in this nation that should be, because they're part of this nation's fabric and history. And I thought, I better get to work and I better write some of this stuff down, because I've had a front row seat. These are my tias. This is my mom. This is my abuela. They are part of this nation, and this nation needs to know now, and needs to know, and future generations need to know. And I'm not alone in that. You know, the stories that we have become richer the more people tell them from different points of view. So that hasn't changed. That has stayed with me to this day. I think I have gained more confidence over time to put my vision out into the world and not be apologetic. So for instance, when I wrote In the Heights on Broadway, that was like in the early and mid 2000s, aughts. And then now I wrote the screenplay for In the Heights. So I'm a different writer now than I was back then. And I think that if you watch the movie, I'm very proud of the stage musical, but the movie feels a little different. It feels like someone who not only has a feminist spirit, but has the tools and the fearlessness to write the scene in a slightly more feminist way, to write the scene in a slightly more brazen and brassy way. I think I have decided and feel now like I have earned a seat at the table, or I'm very proud of the table I've made, and I'm going to use that. And, you know, no one has unlimited time. So I think I've come a little bit, I've come far in that regard.
I'm afraid it is my task to notice that it's 2:30 to try to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for being here and for speaking with us and for reading for us. We've been looking forward to it as a community for a long time, and we're very honored.
Well, thank you to everyone there in Lancaster. Thank you to Cindy and to Rachel and Wilfredo, and Franklin and Marshall community. I hope everyone has a beautiful day, and I really appreciate you spending an hour with me today.
Happy end of the pandemic year.
Hey.